Welcome everyone to session 6. We just have a couple more to go. Appreciate everyone being here today. I'm going to invite our panelists over. My name is Anish Bhatnagar. I'm the CEO of Soleno Therapeutics. I'm a physician by training. I've been in the drug development world for about 20 plus years, run lots of trials, including in India. This is going to be an interesting panel, so let me invite our panelists over. It'll be more informal than the others, so please head on up. Can you hear me? That works. Does it work? All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to ask everyone to introduce themselves briefly, take about 3 to 5 minutes, talk about yourself, your experience running trials, if you have run them in India, what your experience has been. So I'm going to start with Mok. Go ahead, Mok.
Thanks very much, Anish. So my name is Mok Sharma, although if you're from India, then you call me Mukesh. But
I don't think your mic is working. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Oh, yes. So my name is Mok Sharma. If you're from the Indian subcontinent, then you probably call me Mukesh, but only my mum calls me Mukesh now. So I'm currently the head of global development operations at Bristol Myers Squibb. I've been there for a year, obviously a very large organization. Before that, I worked for 7 years in a medium-sized company in Boston called Alexion, obviously very prominent in rare disease, where I spent 7 years building our rare disease engine in Alexion at that time. Alexion was then acquired by AstraZeneca, and AstraZeneca is now part of AstraZeneca's rare disease capability. And I guess I was interested in this because in this area particularly. So, well, actually, I'll go back. Before Alexion and rare disease, I actually worked for 12 years in Novartis Oncology. And I was interested in rare disease quite specifically because, all of us have to work hard. But for me, it's very important that every day when I come to work, there's a reason that I come to work and I work hard. In oncology, I got that feedback every day about why I need to work hard and work quickly, etc., because patients can't wait. And then I was introduced to the world of rare disease. And I think the thing that resonated for me and why I enjoyed it so much, although it's very challenging, I think, to be successful in rare disease in clinical trials, is that it's not just a question of working hard and working quickly, but if we don't try, then probably nobody else will try because it's rare, because the capabilities you need to be successful in running rare disease clinical trials are not so easy. And it's quite difficult to actually work out how to be successful. And that's what was really interesting, I think, and challenging. And that's why I'm really interested in rare disease, particularly, I think, as we think about globalizing the work, about how we work in both developed countries, let's say. A lot of rare disease enrollment takes place in the US, Western Europe, Korea, Japan, etc. But a lot of the time, we also need to look outside of those more simple countries to work, at least from a regulatory framework perspective, because rare diseases are rare, because we need to go to the ends of the earth to find patients. Because of the design of the studies, often we need both pre-treated patients and treatment-naive patients. And so quite often we end up having to work in countries which are not so straightforward to work in, and we have to learn how to do it. In terms of India specifically, I'd say my experience is that it's not the easiest of countries to work, but by a long way, it's not the most difficult of countries to work with. And so I think it's always of interest. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pankaj Bhargav. I'm a physician scientist by training, worked in academia for several years, and then in industry, both large and small pharma. I'm currently a partner at a venture capital firm called MPM Capital, and also run one of our portfolio companies called AshiBio, which is focused on rare diseases in bone and connective tissue. So my interest in rare diseases was really sparked in early on in my industry career. I worked at one point at Sanofi, a large global company, and it was during that time when Sanofi acquired Genzyme. So two very different companies, and I was one of the folks working on the portfolio integration, and it was really eye-opening to see how rare disease development has commonalities, but also some very distinct differences, both in clinical development, regulatory, commercial, across the board, and how the focus on individual patients is so important, because each individual patient is a story. And it's not that it's not the case in the other therapeutic areas, but here every patient's data is so precious. It was instructive when you walked into the Genzyme building. In the lobby, you had pictures of individual patients and their stories, which was really, really very motivating. And then later in my career, I worked at a company where we were developing therapies using small interfering RNA, siRNA, in oncology and in rare diseases. And we ended up developing a drug for an ultra-orphan disease called primary hyperoxaluria, a product that ended up showing remarkable efficacy. And then we ended up working with one of our partners at Alnylam and taking the drug forward. And it was really gratifying to see it get on the market for patients and really benefit these patients. And it was instructive to see the clinical development paradigm. As I was working with my teams, we really had to go to the corners of the earth, just so to say. We have to go to countries in Europe, in Middle East, etc., to find these patients, and then to really work with these patients and understand their individual journeys, and how can we help them participate in a drug trial which could potentially benefit them. And one instructive story, we were at a site in Israel, an area which unfortunately is caught up in conflict right now, but a site up in Haifa in Israel. And we were walking with the principal investigator, and you basically end up with the family of a patient, a young child who has this disease, and the mother is bringing the child to the center in Israel. But the mother is from, she's a Palestinian patient. She has to cross the border every day. And we talked to the patient about doing, coming to the site every 2 weeks. And the mother, they're saying, well, I really don't know if I can cross the border again in 2 weeks. It depends on whether they'll let me in or not. So those kinds of things really open your eyes to the challenges in rare disease development. And it's been really instructive to work with this field, and so nice to be here among like-minded people and talk more about the development and bridging India and the US. So looking forward to the conversation. And thanks, Anish.
Hi, I'm Rusty Clayton. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Larimer Therapeutics. I'm a pediatric pulmonologist by training. And I think it was actually during my practice at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia where I started really getting interested in rare diseases for whatever reason. I'm not sure. It's not something I meditated over. It's just an interest of mine during my practice. So when I left practice for industry after spending some time at Merck, that was my large company experience. The first company I landed in, the next company was a small company. I've been with small companies ever since. And that company was looking at a product that would serve several different orphan diseases, where I was the head of research and development there. From there, went to another company that, again, was working with rare diseases. And then just prior to joining Larimer, I served as a consultant for 7 years. And I would say all told, for all 7 of those years, I dealt almost exclusively with small companies that were trying to get clinical programs going or get regulatory, get through the regulatory process for rare diseases, and particularly rare diseases in children. And how I came to be up here on the stage was for one of those clients, we were doing a global trial for a rare disease. And we happened to have 3 sites in India. I came in as an interim chief medical officer for this company. Their chief medical officer had moved on, and they had selected these sites. And they said, well, what's your experience with doing trials in India? And I said, well, I really don't have any, but I'm willing to learn. And so I learned the hard way, which always teaches you the best lessons, I think. And so I enjoyed that experience. I say enjoy in quotes because some of it was not enjoyable, but I did have the opportunity to visit India twice, something I probably would not have done in my lifetime otherwise. And I would be happy to share those experiences. And I also want to thank, by the way, the organizer of this conference for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anish. Good morning, everyone. You all heard quite a bit from me yesterday. The perspective I'm bringing to this particular session is my background in computer science and engineering, leading to data science and genomics and precision medicine, working for the National Institutes of Health and FDA over the years. Rare disease happened by destiny. It was not a choice. And when it happened in 2012, as a rare dad, I got involved more as a curious social entrepreneur as to what the unmet needs are. And in that sense, 2 major problems got me really intrigued and sucked into the space. One is the inefficiencies in drug development, which is inefficient and unsustainable. Hearing costs like $2 to $3 billion to bring one therapy to market, it doesn't make any sense for rare diseases when the target population is so small to begin with. And the timelines of 10 to 12 years to bring a therapy through the clinical development process also does not make any sense. We have to act with a sense of emergency and urgency, like the Operation Warp Speed that was presented this morning. So efficiency and universal access. When we looked at the clinical trial landscape, as Dr. Nambiar pointed out in her presentation, number of sites in Asia and the rest of the world are very negligible for most disease areas. And so how do we enable universal access to therapies, both during development and after, and how to make that process more efficient? And to bring my professional experience and working in this ecosystem, we have built a technology platform that, with a very outsider perspective, but listening to over 5,000 stakeholders of clinical trials over the last 5 years since we founded Jiva in 2019, around the same time that we founded Indo US Organization for Rare Disease also. So I come at it as a social entrepreneur, starting with the nail and trying to see what are the toolkit needs to look like and what the solution architecture needs to look like. So we are really pleased to see the first couple clinical trials in India. Although most of our pilot studies happened in the United States, the first CAR T cell gene therapy for B-cell lymphoma received a regulatory approval in India. It was indigenously developed by ImmunoAct, a company spin out from Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. We are really honored to have supported that study on the Jiva platform, and I'll be sharing some insights on how that's driving efficiency and cost reduction in enabling affordable clinical development. Thanks, Anish.
Thanks, Harsha. So I think all of us on this panel have some experience with trials in different geographies, including in India. So how do you all think of those differences? What are the key differences between doing a trial, let's say here or in Western Europe, and doing it in India? Mok, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Anish. So I think I'm going to answer the question maybe with a little lens of rare disease, I guess, just in the interest of time. But I think for me, there's always a macro framework and then a micro execution kind of thing. The macro framework is around the prevalence of the disease, of course, those normal things. But also in rare disease, most patients spend a long time, 7 years is the number I have in my head, trying to get accurately diagnosed, and sometimes never get diagnosed accurately, and they're treated for adjacent or sometimes not even relevant diseases. And so I think there needs to be, a framework which is more normally well established in economically advantaged countries rather than developing countries around the diagnosis and treatment of rare disease, the recognition of the disease, the provision of the screening tests and other things. Because if there's no prospect for treatment, it's not so easy for patients, and often the actual diagnosis is by perhaps a differential diagnosis of exclusion. But so the first thing is this framework. There's another part of the framework which is critical, I think, when you're working, let's say, in Southeast Asia versus the US or Western Europe, which is that, we try to manage to try to do the right thing vis-a-vis patients. And there's always a question around running the clinical trial in the country, but then what's the prospect of actually being able to provide a commercial treatment to those patients in the country post-approval, we hope, et cetera, et cetera. And if we can't answer that question well, then most of the time we're not going to put patients in clinical trials in those countries, because then we'll be on the wrong side of history in terms of we included patients in clinical trials, but we didn't make a treatment available because there wasn't an appropriate pricing and reimbursement structure to actually have a return on investment, at least a modest one even. And so I think those are a few of the macro questions which I think are important working in, let's say, India versus US or France or Germany.
Thank you. Pankaj, thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm just going to add on to that to say that I think on a practical level, so I worked in India in clinical trials in oncology, a relatively rare oncology indication, but in oncology, the referral pathways, the treatment centers, et cetera, are more well established, and there is a place where you can find these patients. You can go work with the folks who are treating these patients, and there are some standards of care. What often happens in the setting of a rare or ultra rare condition, and we are finding this out now as we are working in a rare bone disease situation where there are no standards of care, and the patients are really, really hard to find. And I think the role of the advocacy organizations is not to be understated. They are hugely important in educating the patients, connecting the patients, and channeling all the information to patients. And oftentimes in some of the rare disease situations, there are no organizations in some of the geographies. So those are some of the challenges, I think, that are unique to the rare disease setting. I think those are the areas where hopefully we can help the community as we go into a rare disease setting. Oftentimes, these things get organized when there's a therapeutic, when there's a drug in sight. My hope is that with the rare disease work that we do in India and try to bridge from the US, we can help the community to get organized and also help the patient advocacy work that is going on or has yet to begin in those geographies.
Rusty?
Thank you. So I'm just going to expand just a little bit more on some of those ideas, and I'm going to do it from the lens now of the small US-based company that doesn't have the resources, for example, of a BMS. Because there, the world looks very big, and you look very small in comparison. So when you want to go into a geography like India or South America or other places where it's not your typical, hey, let's do a clinical trial in Germany, Australia, Canada, you're into geographies where you're not typically doing the clinical trials. The question then arises in my mind, well, why aren't you? And part of the reason is that, again, the infrastructure is not the same in some of those areas as it is in the United States or Western Europe. Another thing is you can find centers of excellence in India, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a center of excellence for clinical trials as well. Sometimes you have excellent care, but they're not equipped, staffed, capable, or knowledgeable in terms of doing the clinical studies. And that becomes a major difficulty as well. Expanding on the concept of the standard of care, we have to make sure when we're doing a clinical study that the background is as homogeneous as possible, particularly with rare diseases. We don't have a lot of numbers. When you have a really heterogeneous population, you can have, you can cure that to some degree by studying hundreds or even thousands of subjects. When you have literally just a couple hundred subjects in a rare disease, you cannot afford heterogeneity. And one of the ways to decrease that heterogeneity is to make sure that the standard of care is as uniform as possible as the background. And that becomes very difficult when even within a geography, there's a huge disparity in the standard of care. So again, another thing that you have to deal with. The last perspective that I want to share before I turn the mic over is that for a small company, it's very easy, relatively easy, to find expertise in the US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, and clinical research organizations that say that they're strong in those areas. Typically, they're telling the truth. They're not being as economical with the truth as when you're asking, hey, how do you do in South America or India? And they, oh, yeah, well, we have people there. And what they mean literally is they have one or two people there. And it's not the same as getting good local knowledge. So when my experience in India is that I really needed to rely on an India-based partner, people with hundreds of feet on the ground, to help just find out where things were, where the patients were, where the good study sites were, even things like getting goods imported for the study. So that's just sharing some of my experience, from that perspective.
Harsha?
Yeah, so from my point of view, when we asked this question to various stakeholders, sponsors, CROs, sites, patient advocacy groups, we were deeply involved in conversations. The number one thing is the barrier around not just looking at it as running one clinical trial, but making a long-term commitment for that country and region to not just use that as a venue for recruiting patients and completing a clinical trial, but rather making that long-term commitment to commercialize it there, make it available in that region, which is significantly disadvantageous for smaller biotechs and pharma, like Rusty pointed out, which they may have resource constraints. Even though in theory, everybody agreed that, yes, we need to engage the rest of the world, there is no arguments there. But in practice, that's one big barrier. The second big barrier from a regulatory point of view is India, for example, does not allow first-in-human trials for therapies that are developed outside of India. So you need to have manufacturing and make it in India for first-in-human, although you can do the safety-proven treatments can be developed and commercialized in India. And the third perspective from, if you look at only 2% of global clinical trials seem to have some footprint in India. 98% of clinical trials, global trials, don't have footprint in India, including rare and common indications. Proportional to 15% of the global population that just India now carries the burden of. And so there is a severe underrepresentation in that regard, which everybody appreciated. But to make that happen, we need to overcome these practical barriers. And the third, which is, if we ran a site in India, would that be acceptable to the US FDA for commercializing in the US also, right? And so it may need to be a separate study run under the Indian regulatory body CDSCO versus US FDA study. And so those barriers have to be worked through. And so in the rare disease space, though, people don't take no for an answer. And the patient advocates are warriors, and they identify these barriers and want to break them, and can't be broken by any one stakeholder. And so we need to form coalitions and come together to make that happen.
So to pull on that thread a bit, I feel like you've all been very balanced about India. There's good and there's bad. So it's clear that disproportionately large number of trials don't happen in India. So Let's talk about what in your mind is one really bad thing and one really good thing about what you've experienced with India. Pankaj, you want to start?
Sure. So I think the good thing about India, there are lots of good things, but I think the good thing that I've reflected on often, based on the experience in doing a study in oncology there, that if you work with the right people who really are focused on getting to the truth, getting to the answers in the clinical trial setting, and partner with them, don't treat them as just a site in a global study. Go partner with them, go talk with them. I think you just get such amazing quality of data and the dedication that you get from people out there. They're high quality doctors. They want to do the right thing. The staff there is amazing. And we came out of the experience with really high appreciation of the quality aspect. And this is where, our teams were, quite frankly, quite concerned going in, to say that, are we going to get the right quality of data, the quality of patients? And we had a great experience. I think on the challenging side, and something that, Mok touched on, in a larger company setting, the question that keeps coming up all the time is about commercialization, and about whether the company, and this is where conversations, to be very transparent with groups in the commercial organization, et cetera, that's where conversations end up sort of breaking down, where when people look at, especially in a rare disease setting, what is the sort of commercial prospect of a drug in a geography like India. And if you go there to do clinical trials, you must be committed to then making the drug available in the long term and commercialization. And that's where the numbers don't always match, which is where I think a country like India has this issue where several of the large pharmas don't end up going to India for clinical trials.
Rusty?
Can I do two?
Yes, you can
Okay,
do two.
great. Thank you. So I'll just start with where I left off previously. So part of the reason why it's challenging, I think, to find sites in India is it's so easy to find the smart people in Western Europe and Australia and Canada. And it was really more of a challenge to find the subject matter experts in India, at least, in my experience. And that's the challenge. The good thing is that once I found them, I was so happy to have an hour of their time. And I mean, literally wished I could spend a week chatting. The physicians in India, the ones I've worked with, so well trained, so articulate, so caring about their population. And this is, I think, the good. And I think to kind of cure that, we have to find a way to get those physician scientists that are working in India, get them more global prominence, so we can see who they are over in this little geography that we call the United States. So that's the one. The second is, the good thing is that there is certainly a lot of people there, right? I mean, that's goes without saying. 1.4 billion. That you're officially India is the largest population in the world right now, and with that is going to become a rich resource, so to speak, with regard to being able to find patients for the study. The challenge there, of course, then is in some places where these patients are finding their care. There's just no. I've gone and I've seen some of these very large practices, and just the doctor's so smart, and there's a lot of patients there, but how do I get them to conform to GCP? At the end of the day, if I enroll 100 subjects in a rare disease, that's a huge number of patients. But will they survive an inspection, from FDA or something like that? So I think the challenge is the medical expertise is there, the clinical trial expertise, and that's not the doctor, that's the staff. Everybody who's run clinical trials know the doctor's not the important one, it's the clinical coordinator. Getting those folks up to that degree is something that I think if it's done, we'd see a lot more trials in India.
So one fundamental aspect that the whole ecosystem seems to miss, in my opinion, both in US and India, is India did not have what we call allopathic medicine or English medicine until very few decades ago, really, right? The traditional medicine in India is Ayurveda and homeopathy. And so all these small molecule gene therapies, novel modalities, most of these were originally developed outside of India. And the Indian clinical trial ecosystem only started developing in the 90s and in the 2000s. And so since then, India has come a long way, right? We don't even think about what was before in the previous millennium, but these types of drugs never existed until very recently. And so the process of developing these drugs is not available in most countries, right? Because US FDA is one and only in one country. And the orphan drugs, especially approved by the FDA, are accepted and even approved for marketing in India without most of the time requiring additional trials in India. And so that's a very positive rule that was brought about recently. Kudos to the Indian government. But what that means is the challenge is to educate and inform all stakeholders about the need to educate and train the process. I know, being in clinical trial space for the last 5 years, we have to follow a military protocol in clinical trials. We can't have any excuses. The data has to be entered. The audit trail has to be there. The GCP, like Rusty said, that attention to detail, and that's all done by staff members who work for these busy physicians. And nowhere in the world the investigator is going to have the time to get all this data organized. And so training the staff to build that understanding, which exists already in India, but needs a lot more training. And that I think there are a lot of global CROs with that capability now, with feet on the ground in India, that can make it happen. So the resources and infrastructure are there.
Thanks, Mok.
I think for me, the way I'm going to answer the question is to, rather than to look at India, is I see that many of the barriers actually are in our own heads around how we perceive India and the challenges of working there. And I think I kind of, go back to my mum again, I guess, that there isn't good or bad weather. It's just whether you're wearing the right clothes or not, I think. And what I mean by that is that quite often we have perceptions like there'll be poor quality, or there'll be hundreds of patients clamoring to get into the trial and then the trial will become unbalanced, or that patients are desperate for treatment and there'll be a high placebo response, which will upset the statistics of the trial and treatment effect. And I think all of these things are manageable. And I think the biggest change, I think, particularly in rare disease, is rather than looking for sites which look like sites and then saying, do they have patients, is to say, where are the patients? And once we know where they are, then that's where we're going to go. Now it's just a question of how do we equip the site and how do we work with the site to work in the right way, in the right environment, with the right results, kind of thing. And so, at least in my experience, sometimes that's, we need an informed consent in Mongolian by tomorrow morning because a patient is coming and then they're going to fly to somewhere else or whatever. Or in the India context, we have a lot of patients at a site, maybe 10% of the enrollment of the whole study, but the site doesn't know anything about clinical research. That's okay. We can take that bet as long as we're prepared for it. And so we literally have people who live at the site during the screening and treatment or the baseline assessment of all of those patients, kind of thing, because that's what it takes to be successful. So I think for me, a lot of the barriers are actually not to do with India, but about our perception of how to be successful in rare disease and about how we're trying to fit the world of rare disease into our perception rather than adjusting how we work to actually manage where the patients are.
Thanks. So I'm going to pull on one more thread before we come back to more general questions. So, most of you mentioned this idea of, can you do a trial in a country where you're not intending to commercialize? There's another side of that you could do a trial and benefit at least some patients. So how do you balance that? And maybe it's different for small versus larger companies, but how do you think of this? Feel free to start, anyone.
What I heard in one of the panels where I posed this question to a group of CEOs recently is India is seen as more of a compassionate use ground. And so because of the challenges discussed earlier, because there is no resource to commercialize or a pathway to commercialize and the orphan therapy in India, the mechanism that's preferred so far has been compassionate use or expanded access. And so that's we need to see how we can break that perception, like Mok was saying, and how we can change this and drive this as not just look at it as a compassionate ground. Like Bhaskar's presentation indicated, there is infrastructure, there's a lot of billionaires, there's money, and so it's a market. So it just like any other market. So that's the change we need to see.
Mok?
Sure. And I'll speak now as Moke and not as Bristol Myers Squibb or Alexian, because it's a very nuanced question. So at least what I see is that, number one, there's a very intense need to be ethically correct and to understand whether it's a declaration of Helsinki, World Health Organization, which level of patient inclusion are we actually going to work to? Both from a technical perspective, we subscribe to the Declaration of Helsinki, that's clinical trial patients. Yes, we know how to do that, but also, I guess, importantly for all companies nowadays, from an optics perspective, that even if we are compliant with the Declaration of Helsinki, and of course we're going to be, well, are we still on the right side of history when it comes to did we do the right thing in India or other countries? And I think at least what I see is that at least my experience is that in a small or medium-sized company, there is a greater degree of individualization rather than in a big company where obviously big companies have policies and other things which are much more difficult to flex than in a medium-sized company.
And just to add a comment to the commercialization conundrum, as I call it, it's in a large company setting, as I said earlier, India and the commercial market in India and the pricing that really cannot be sustained there does come as a barrier. But that's an area where we've talked about it. I don't see as much of it happening, but how can there be local partnerships, just like pharma companies do partnerships in the context of Asia, of China? I mean, the whole commercialization market there is different. The way you price the drug and the way you work in that market and with the regulatory agency is quite distinct. I think sort of a possible way forward here is to have that local partnership with a company that's local to India and have a commercialization structure through that partner that makes sense to both parties. And I think that could be in the right setting, a way forward in the rare disease space.
Rusty?
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And particularly from the lens, again, of the small company. The small company's dream typically is not to be a global commercialization giant, but to be acquired by a global commercialization giant. And so they're hoping, they're not necessarily thinking forward, to that degree. All the same, when a client that I've worked with said, well, we want to do the study in South America, we want to do the study in India, we want to do a study. My answer to them is, that's fine, but ethically speaking, you have to have at least some plan for commercialization. I get, well, we're going to license that out. So that's fine. Have a plan for licensing it out then. But have a plan after all, because you do want to, I believe you have the ethical obligation to, if you're going to do a study in a country, where are those patients going to get that product once the study is over? And compassionate use is a way forward. Commercialization is a way forward. or even partnering with a group that is good at commercialization in that region is a way forward. But have a plan.
So to pull on that a bit, if you, let's say you're developing a drug which is more of a short term or a one-time use, right? Let's say it's an antimicrobial for some crazy antibiotic resistant. Would you feel better doing the trials there and not commercializing?
I think I would feel worse. Yeah, I mean, I mean, my view of the short-term drugs are they're just as vital. So, and in your case with the case use example with the infection, I'm not thinking of a runny nose. I'm thinking about something that could be potentially life-threatening. My feeling with anti-infectives, and I'm not an expert by any means in that area, is that when they're developed, they need to get to everywhere where people have that infection. And so I would feel the same urgency, or maybe even more so, with regard to that, because with a longer term illness, there are other ways in our current global network to get drugs to those folks, and not necessarily through the channels that we all ascribe to. But for a short term and an acute condition, that drug has to be there at the time when that patient needs it. And that's why I said it's probably worse, is you have to have it available at that time. Nobody has the time to go through, for example, a compassionate use protocol or something like that. You need it right away.
Any differences in opinion on that?
I'm going to be very supportive. I think as an industry, we litigated this question of anti-infectives in the 1990s, particularly around using patients in Africa with placebo and other things kind of thing. And so I'm 100% on board with Rusty. I think that presents maybe more acute challenges, as patients have one shot, than in more chronic indications where there are other mechanisms we can use kind of thing. But it's, or at least in my experience, every time we would come across this situation, it's always case by case. How can we be on the right side of history here? How can we do the right thing?
Let's talk about HIV and how it was eventually dealt with. Could that be a way to deal with a rare disease situation? So you develop these drugs, you do the trials where they can be done, and you find a way to basically make no money off of them in geographies where they cannot be sold for anything substantial. Would that work?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point you bring up, Anish, because in my previous role at a company called Gilead Sciences, which really is one of the leaders in HIV medications, that paradigm can work because one of the statistics that Gilead is very proud of is the fact that they developed the drug globally, and in Africa, just as an example, there are millions of patients who receive HIV drugs that are made by Gilead, but only less than 10% of them pay for that. The rest is all provided on a compassionate basis, et cetera. But that's in the setting of a much larger commercial population in the West and in Europe, et cetera, where the companies can do that. I just that sort of a paradigm is hard when you're talking about a rare disease situation. I mean, just to be perfectly candid, that takes a lot from a company where each patient's commercialization is so important to have the numbers work for the company.
I think there's two aspects to that. The first aspect is there's what I call the non-monetary compensation. And that's where you're doing something and you're not going to make money from it. You may actually lose money from it. But then it just moves from one budget to another. This becomes, in a sense, our public relations budget or our advertising budget. So we're going to do a good thing, and we're not going to do it because we want a pat on the back. We're going to do it because it's the right thing to do. But as a natural byproduct, we're still allowed to say, hey, we gave away so much care to underprivileged areas of the world. And there is some payback there. It's just not something that shows up on the balance sheet per se. The second thought, and I hope I didn't lose it. I'm a little old, so
We can come back to you if you want.
I think I can get it back. Actually, is no, I can't get it back. Come back to me.
All right, Jeev, Harsha or Mok, any thoughts?
I'll just say that I'm really pleased to see this conversation happening. I mean, the decisions are made by the sponsors, and this is the type of conversation we like to see happen in your boardrooms, in your executive management teams. Ask these tough questions and make choices based on what's best interest for the patients, which we all do every single day. But we often forget the emerging markets and the rest of the world. That's not something top of the mind all the time. So it's great to put this on top of mind of all of you.
Rusty, did you get it back?
Yeah, I did.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
And it's really just simple arithmetic and economics, isn't that? If you're going to break even, which is your best case scenario, or you're going to lose money, which is your not the best case scenario, you have to make that up somewhere. And you make that up in the areas where you can charge more. And with the price pressure that globally the companies are under, you're going to see less, that those margins are going to start to dwindle. And as those margins dwindle, that's less economically that you can take less money from somewhere else or even break even for that particular product.
Mok, I'm not going to let you go without answering this one.
So I think, let me answer in this way, I think. Most organizations, I talk about my current one, Bristol Myers Squibb. So we are evolving our low and middle income country strategy to work out different commercial models, different reimbursement models, different pricing models to actually allow us to access, because, you know, we try to do our best. But if you think about India and China, there's 3 billion people there virtually, maybe, you know, more than a third of the world's population, who we're kind of underserving, I guess, as an industry as a whole kind of thing. And so we try to work on that. I think when it comes to rare disease, I think the bar increases, and that's why I still feel that there's always a case-by-case case, because rare disease is much more difficult to make a return on the investment. I think we still need to make a return of some kind, even if it's somewhere else and not in low and middle income countries or India or wherever kind of thing. And then I think if we have perhaps a rare disease and a high cost of goods, I don't know, let's say cell therapy, where it's handcrafted kind of thing and high complexity, then it becomes even more difficult to work out, well, how is it going to work from a numbers perspective as well as from a patient perspective and a logistical perspective. So for me, I think what I see is that most organizations are busy trying to work out how to do the right thing, but case by case is sometimes it gets really, really complicated and really, really difficult.
Thanks. So I know that we're running a bit late, but I'll ask a closing question to all of you. I apologize for not asking the question that we prepped for. So if you had the power to change, you know, two things, what would you do to make trials in rare disease trials in a place like India more feasible? Take a minute to think if you wish. Whoever is ready can start.
I can go first. One, have very clear guidance from the regulatory agencies on how these clinical trials should be conducted in a way that can make it accessible, but also acceptable to the regulators from a point of view of data, but also GCP and other guidances, so that it's not a risk for the sponsors, or de-risk it as much as possible. So they can go with that confidence that this will be acceptable. The second is training and education. Have a organization or a certification type process, which on a global scale, right now, even in the United States, there is a significant shortage of staff for clinical trial operations at the site level. We are all burdened coming out of the pandemic. severe shortages. So, and that's true across the world. And so we need that trained staff. Those are the two things, I think.
Thanks, Rusty.
Yeah, we haven't talked much about patient advocacy groups, a little bit of mention, but not much. And I think one thing I would change, and not just for India, but elsewhere, is that the patient advocacy, when you have a good patient advocacy group, it's so much easier to do clinical trials in that region where you have a strong one. When you have 3 or 4 advocacy groups in one region, it's more difficult. And when you have none, it's nearly impossible. But I would take that a step further, is because you're probably going to say, well, you need to develop more patient advocacy groups in India. But I would take it a step farther. Patient advocacy groups that are region-centric, I believe, need to globalize. I saw this very recently with Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, where they have now linked with their European counterparts, and it's now essentially one patient advocacy group. I was on the phone with the CEO for FARA Australia a couple months ago, and they're talking about globalizing that patient advocacy group. And what I would change or encourage is make sure that you go to every region where any patients that you might have, you just reach out to everywhere and try to globalize that patient advocacy group, because everybody benefits. There's no detriment to that. So that's the one thing I would change. The second thing I would change, and I mentioned this, is the medical and scientific community has to find a way to not be so parochial and have Western medicine elevate their key opinion leaders. We need to bring in folks from these other regions, these brilliant doctors, and elevate them so we know who they are and that they can contribute.
Good.
Well, I had 2 points. One, Rusty spoke about already about the patient advocacy group, so I'm not going to repeat that, but I can't stress the importance of that in the rare disease setting. And I think it's, as I said earlier, typically these patient advocacy groups get formed or get more empowered in the context of a new drug or a therapeutic. And how can we encourage that and support that for the benefit of all patients? That's definitely something that I would very much focus on. The second is, I think regulations are changing, and I think this was alluded to earlier, but in in recent experience, it hasn't been as straightforward or as timely to get regulatory approvals in the Indian setting. And I think there is room for improvement there, and I would absolutely, that would be my wish list, I would say, is to have the ability to talk with the regulatory agencies like you're able to, talk and work with the FDA here. I think that would go a long way.
Final word.
Okay. So for me, I think I'm going to go with Team Rusty, actually, in terms of patient advocacy. I think in rare disease, understanding the patient journey is the most critical part, I think, of enrolling clinical studies. So those organizations play a critical part in that, whether it's with us or with regulators. I think the second thing I'd think about is going back to Peter Marks this morning in terms of the regulatory framework, is how can we use technology, real-world data, modeling in silico to reduce the clinical trial requirements for not just approval, because as Peter said, we can get an accelerated approval, but then we end up not unreasonably with a post-marketing requirement. Sometimes, believe it or not, that post-marketing requirement is a randomized study, which is very difficult ethically when you have efficacy and things, or you think you have efficacy and whatever. So I think the more that we can work in a consolidated way with regulators to reduce the burden of actual patient data, I think the better we can accelerate clinical trials and use fewer rare disease patients to actually generate the evidence rather than treating them, and maybe working in a real world way to confirm those data.
Thank you.
Any
Questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Reena, you want to go first?
Yeah, just a quick comment. It's not a question. I couldn't resist myself when Mok told me that There's no good or bad weather. It only depends on how good we dress. I'm from Minnesota, so where the weather goes down to -20, and it can stay that way for maybe couple of weeks with a wind chill of -40 Fahrenheit for people in India. It's in Fahrenheit. So, but it took me, now I've been lived there for 15 years, but it's just that there is a learning process. It took me 5 to 7 years to find the right clothes, to feel warm, to survive in that weather. And I guess in changing the perspectives about doing clinical trials in India, there's also a learning process. And we started this organization in 2019. We are at the 4th year. We are talking about this now. Maybe in a couple of years, we can change that perspective of all the people who are looking for conducting clinical trials back in India. And to Rusty's point about trying to identify the experts in India who are really good, that's another one of our mission. Trying to find those people, make them part of our research core, and then educate those clinical staff on good GMP, good manufacturing, or clinical practices and manufacturing practices. That's another goal of our organization. I guess we need to expand, which means we need funding. So I guess that's the kind of the balance there. Trying to get good support is one thing, which our goals are big, but trying to find that support is something we are trying to do in the organization. So thank you.
Thanks, Reena.
And get those doctors to come here to meetings in the US so we get to know who they are.
Or we can meet them when we are in India next year for the conference.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So there was a recent study which was done in India by Price Waterhouse, and in this study they came out with a revelation that the cost for doing clinical trials in the US have gone up by about 15% on a compounded basis over a period of about 9 years from 2010 to 2019. Don't you think we can kind of optimize this cost? We can bring down the cost by introducing or doing these clinical trials in a country like India, where probably, I don't know, I don't think really any studies have been done to do a comparative study to say whether it's going to be cheaper to do the trials in India or not. The challenges are going to be anywhere. It's not that India has some unique challenges which are not surmountable. You can come around. Just as Mok also mentioned, that we have to adjust ourselves to the environment over there, and then look at the market and look at the environment over there to do the trials. So is it not possible to do that? And that, I think, has an overall impact on the final cost of the drug as well. Because if you're spending more for your clinical trials, your cost and the time period which is being required for the trials gets extended, which you can shorten out, make it more economical, more optimization of cost in a country like India. Don't you think it's something like that is possible?
A quick anecdote from me, then feel free to address. I did an oncology trial in 7 countries at one point in time. This was a few years ago, and the thought process was that a place like India would give us a substantial number of patients and would make the cost be substantially lower. Didn't work that way. What we realized was that even though we were in the top centers in India for doing this trial, I think we had 7 or 8 centers in India, the kind of infrastructure support that we had to provide, the staff support, the training, the ongoing support with data entry, monitoring of data, actually made it cost just about the same. But I don't know if anyone else has had similar or different experiences.
I was going to say it's 2 things. First of all, Price Waterhouse needs to go back and do their homework, because since 2019, costs have gone up more than 15%. But yeah, we had a very similar experience where the base costs to do the study in India appeared to be less, but by the time we had to put the extra resources in place, it started to look more like a break-even model. I think that the answer is we have to find ways of decreasing the cost of doing clinical research, whether it's in India or elsewhere. We have to find ways that are more efficient. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to run an inefficient clinical study. But we are not as efficient because I don't think we've really thought enough about it. And I think that we could be more efficient, more cost effective.
One way to do it could be the Mok way, where he's hiring about a few thousand people in Hyderabad. Did you want to mention that?
I can now. So I think, but actually, I'm not going to address it in that way, I think. I want to come back to your question. So actually, most large organizations like my own do actually understand the costs in each country quite well. And most have gone at some time in their evolution through a kind of globalization or change of the country footprint. In fact, I also am doing exactly that in terms of I look at the proportion of patients we enroll in the US and could it be different? Should it be different? Actually, it should be different. And so we're looking now at expanding the global reach of our clinical studies. We have 5 new countries this year, and not one of the new countries, but actually we do very significantly build our presence in India from a Bristol-Myers Squibb perspective, from the preclinical through clinical trials, through commercialization, et cetera, presence. But for me, the driver isn't about cost. The most important thing that I can do for my business is to go faster. And if I look at the US, still probably the largest country for enrollment in the Bristol-Myers Squibb clinical trial portfolio, the US is, yes, okay, probably the more expensive end kind of thing for various reasons, but also the most competitive because we compete with people like ourselves, we compete with cooperative groups, we compete with biotech, everybody's there. You know, if we look at lupus, 47 clinical trial programs which patients could go to. And so I think for me, one of the most impactful reasons why I look outside of the US is actually to find patients fast and to accelerate development, to accelerate bringing new medicines to patients, but also to accelerate bringing commercial return to my business. And I think so to me, that's the driver. Cost saving is great. Acceleration is more great.
Amy?
I have a question. So fascinating conversation. And I know we all agree here that it's really important to invest in new therapies, but also thinking about the existing therapeutics on the market that could be repurposed and possibly repurposed very successfully if you pair it with a personalized approach. So my question is there a investment from the biotech, from the large pharma companies in partnering with institutions, et cetera, to be able to explore how those existing therapeutics could be repurposed? And if so, could that be expanded for biotech and pharma to really be a catalyst for expanded use of these great therapies?
From my perspective, repurposing is like a new drug. So if you're actually repurposing for a new indication, it requires maybe not all the same work, but a lot of work to repurpose it for a specific indication. At least in this country, repurposing an old drug for a new indication is quite substantial. So I'm not sure if it applies to in the way that you're describing, but anyone else on the panel?
I was going to say the same thing, is that when you repurpose a drug, there are some things you can bring along from its prior dossier, but there's a lot that you knew. There's a new population. It's going to be a new adverse event profile. There's a lot new there. Did I cut out? Okay. The other thing I would add is you asked about partnering with institutions. And I think, and particularly biotech, and I think for large companies as well, very interested in partnering with institutions. But there's some institutions, they just seem to get in their own way in doing that. And, you know, it has to be a partnership, which means it's a win-win. When the institute, you know, some institutions, I'll name the institution I used to work with as a physician, the University of Pennsylvania. Very difficult institution to work with because they want everything. So, you know, sometimes the institutions get in the way.
One thing I like to add on that topic, Anish, if I may.
Go ahead.
The Inflation Reduction Act is actually hurting both patient advocacy groups and the sponsors for exactly that purpose, because the Inflation Reduction Act actually punishes by removing the orphan drug incentives on drug repurposing. And so there are patient advocates and leaders testifying in the Congress to make some corrections to the Inflation Reduction Act as we speak, actually. And Frank is one of the few leaders who also testified in the Congress exactly on the topic. Thanks for asking. Mahua
Couple more questions. I know we're running out of time, but go ahead.
No, this is a comment that came online. So this is from Dr. Akkaraju Sarma. all the drugs developed should be in public domain, patent wise is what he says.
Yeah, it was a wonderful session, and I think we all are brainstorming with multiple questions in our head after this. So I have just a perspective on it, like I would like to know from you. We were talking about India more in terms of compassionate ground. And to me, what the barrier seems to be is the fancy multi-million-dollar prices of that each gene therapy comes out with, right? From starting from Glybera to all that. I understand the pressure on recouping the price and everything, but could we think in other way where we talk about more sensible or reasonable pricing and not go towards the Glybera path where it was taken off the market because the pricing was not sustainable apparently. And in that, maybe the economy of scale could be tapped in countries like India, where if taken and more, if clinical trials are taken, more patients base might be found out, more patient diagnosis might happen, and we could actually tap into a larger market, which we don't know that exists there. So why is not there any dialogue in that line?
Rusty, you look like you want to say something. Go ahead.
I was just struck by something that Dr. Mark said this morning is the barriers for gene therapy, and probably the true way to overcome not just the cost barrier in terms of the patient, but also the cost barrier in terms of the country, right? Because you have to get a certain number of patients just to break even, is more efficient manufacturing. And what occurred to me is that the partners in India that I've worked with, one thing that I thought they did really, really, really well was taking the manufacturing process and making it a more streamlined, efficient, economical process. And that may be the way in that, the manufacturing process that costs so much in the US or Europe, find a way to maintain the quality, but manufacture it at a fraction of the price. And then I think you remove that differential to a large degree.
Stay tuned for the next panel, which it will possibly address some of this. And I think we're a little bit over time, so I get to have the last word. I think that most of what's been talked about here is surmountable. I think training, GCP, I think all these things are surmountable. The one thing that's, from a time perspective, more problematic, I think, is the regulatory approval environment for trials and how they're done. And the thing that's intangible, at least right now, is how do you deal with the ethical issues of running trials but not commercializing? So I thank you all for dealing with the tough questions. This was a really good discussion. So thanks, everyone. Let's give them a big hand.